Choosing the right paper for your image is a personal and aesthetic choice that requires you to ask yourself a very basic question. What do I want to convey with my prints? Now, sure, you can simply choose one paper for all your images, but the creative potential of Canson Infinity papers, their strength lies in thinking beyond subject matter or even genre and considering each individual image on its own merits and what you as the photographer want to convey to the viewer. All too often, it's easy to rely on preconceptions or formulas or experts even about how certain images should look and what papers work best for specific subjects. High contrast papers for black and white images, smooth papers for portraits, or papers that hold detail well for landscapes or nature. But choosing a paper that way ignores the most important creative decision you can make as a printmaker. How does a particular paper and its unique surface and its texture complement what you're trying to convey with the image? How does it support your artistic vision? How does it convey the mood, the feel of a photograph? And so thinking about papers in this way places the emphasis on your vision as a photographer and printmaker. And that means that ultimately the medium, in this case the paper, showcases the artwork and gets out of the way. The paper supports your vision instead of drawing attention to itself. Understanding this idea means you can think more creatively about paper choices and choose papers that make your image truly personal, more original. It means you can take advantage of Canson's amazing range of papers to make your prints truly special. When the paper complements the image, it reinforces what the image is about in the most physical and visual way. So I'm going to show you a few examples based on my work and my images and the papers that I've chosen to complement my photographs. And hopefully that'll give you a much clearer understanding of this concept. So let's take a look. Choosing a paper involves thinking about a paper's qualities and how those will impact or complement your image. And we can break these down into three broad areas. One is Dmax or density. That's a function of how much black a paper can hold. And the more black a paper can hold, then the more contrast it will have, the richer the shadows and the more shadow separation you have, and the more aggressive or the more in your face the picture will look because of that higher contrast. Another quality is surface texture, whether it has no texture at all, which means it's very smooth, or whether it has some texture, which will perhaps give it more dimension, or a lot of surface texture, which will give it a very noticeable look to the image. And finally, the last quality is reflectivity. In other words, how reflective the surface of the paper is, like a gloss or a luster paper or satin paper, which is less, or matte paper, which has the least amount of reflection, and that'll again give the paper a certain look. It'll perhaps make it softer, more painterly, much more serene, more quieter even. And so these are the qualities that you have to think about how they match up with your image and whether that's something that you want or don't want. So let's look at a few examples. This first print here is on printmaking rag, which has a beautiful surface texture, a very velvety feel. It's a 100% cotton rag paper, and it has very little surface reflection because it's a matte paper, so the image appears very soft. It looks a little more painterly, a little bit less literal, for example. And I chose this paper because I really want to emphasize the texture here of the moss on the rocks, and the fact that the paper has a little texture, I think, gives that area of the image more dimension. Also, the water here that's blurred out, I also want that to be rather soft and kind of dreamy-like. And because it doesn't have any surface reflection, it kind of helps to keep that water in the back versus coming forward. And finally, all the colors throughout the image, I really wanted to have sort of that more of an abstract feel, which, again, a matte paper like this helps to emphasize. So for me, this paper works really well for this image. The next example is an image which is printed on Baryta Photographique, a much different paper than the printmaking rag. This paper does have a much higher Dmax rating or density. You can see how much more contrasty it looks. The blacks here in the foreground are really meant to push the eye towards these rocks here that have a lot of detail and texture. And because the blacks are so rich, again, they kind of help those areas that have light to come forward. And also, I chose this paper because it has no texture at all. And so this sky area here, which I wanted to be sort of like negative space, once again, to push the eye towards the clouds and towards the texture in the image, helps to give the image that much more dimension and depth. And so again, thinking about what I want the image to look like, the paper complements that vision that I have. The next paper here is Platine fiber rag. A similar paper to Baryta in terms of its Dmax or its density. So again, a lot of contrast. This paper, however, does have a slight surface texture to it. And in this image, that surface texture kind of helps to add unity to the whole image. The fog here in the background, I want it to have a little bit of texture so that it feels as though it's more dimensional. And the paper's reflectivity, in other words, how it reflects light, really helps to emphasize the wet rocks here in the foreground. It makes them feel or look as though you can put your hand in and touch the wet rock. And so that's what I'm trying to emphasize. Plus, I'm also trying to emphasize the contrast because that really makes those rocks more dimensional and gives them a real sense of depth and mood. And so Platine, again, does a wonderful job for this image. This next paper here is once again printmaking rag. And while it is a black and white image, I've chosen a matte paper which has less contrast, less aggressiveness, because that's what I don't want for this image. I don't want this image to be aggressive. I want it to be much more quiet, much more serene, much more abstract, less literal. And these rocks here in the foreground, I don't want each rock to sort of stand out on its own. I want the rocks to be just shadows that push your eye up towards the midtones, back to the shadows, and then back up to the clouds up on top. But in general, I want the image just to be much more subdued. And a matte paper like printmaking rag gives me that feel that I'm looking for, which I think perhaps a different type of paper would not. So that's why I've chosen that paper for this image. This print is printed on Edition Etching Rag, another beautiful cotton rag paper from Canson with a slight texture on the surface. Once again, it's a matte paper, which means that I have a much more subdued, a much more quiet image than, let's say, a gloss or a satin paper would give me. And I like the texture on this paper in this image because it makes all areas of the image interesting. It adds more interest to the sky. It has clouds in it. The colors are changing in the sky. The surface of the water here also has a little more dimension because of that texture. And less density, less contrast, because I don't want the eye to get caught again in heavy areas of contrast here. I want these dark areas or these shadow areas to push the eye towards the highlights. So I'm not looking for shadow separation. I'm looking for darker areas that, again, move the eye towards areas that are brighter and just provide a feel for the viewer, the feel that I want to convey with the image. One last example, a portrait here. One is printed on rag photographique, a very smooth rag paper, and the other one is printed once again on Baryta. And if you look at these images, you can see that they're very similar, but the one on Baryta is a little bit heavier, a little more aggressive, more contrast, a little sharper, maybe a little more literal, and the one on the left, which is on the rag photographique, the matte paper, again, less contrast, a little softer, a little more dreamy, perhaps a little less literal. And while you might argue that the image on the right is perhaps technically better, it's the one on the left that I prefer because it conveys the feel that I want for the photograph, the feel of the girl's face, an age that is now past, and so it's more of a memory about that time. So you can see how the different papers will create different feels, a different way of viewing the image, and that's very important to take into consideration when choosing a paper. If you start to think about paper in this way, you can really elevate your prints to a whole new level and be able to share your vision much more effectively.